That was the first thing everyone remembered afterward. Not the cabin, not the mountain, not even what was eventually discovered beneath the snow. What they remembered was the sound. Every night, just after midnight, the Husky would sit beside the north-facing window of the cabin and scream. Not bark, not howl. Scream! A long, agonizing sound that seemed almost human. The first time it happened, Ethan Mercer nearly fell out of bed. His wife, Claire, thought the dog had been injured. Their 12-year-old daughter, Sadie, burst into tears. But when they rushed into the living room, the Husky wasn't hurt. He was sitting perfectly still, staring into the darkness beyond the glass, and screaming. The dog had never behaved that way before. Not once in 4 years, not in crowded neighborhoods, not during thunderstorms, not when fireworks exploded overhead. Only here, only at this cabin. And every night after that, it happened again, exactly at midnight, as if something outside was calling to him, or as if he was trying desperately to warn them. The Mercer family had moved to the remote mountains, outside the small community of Elk Ridge, Idaho, after the hardest year of their lives. A year earlier, Ethan had survived a devastating construction accident. 3 men had been working a steel framework when part of the structure collapsed. Ethan lived. His closest friend didn't. The guilt followed him everywhere. Doctors treated his injuries. Therapists treated his nightmares. Nothing treated the silence he carried inside. Before the accident, Ethan had been loud, confident, the kind of man who could make strangers laugh in a grocery store. Afterward, he became distant, quiet, haunted. The move to Idaho had been Claire's idea. She hoped the mountains might give their family a chance to start over, a chance to breathe, a chance to heal. The cabin they found sat nearly 6 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by pine forest, nestled in a narrow valley beneath towering ridgelines. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt peaceful, at least during daylight. At night, the valley felt different. The darkness seemed deeper, the silence seemed heavier, and then there was the screaming. The Husky's name was Atlas. A large gray and white rescue dog with pale blue eyes. Normally calm, normally affectionate, but every night, shortly before midnight, he became restless. He paced, whined, scratched at the floor. Then he would move to the north-facing window and scream into the darkness. The first week, Ethan assumed Atlas was reacting to wildlife. Coyotes, elk, maybe wolves. The mountains were full of animals, but something didn't fit. Atlas never reacted during the day, and whenever Ethan stepped outside to investigate, the forest felt empty. No movement, no sounds, nothing, just cold air and darkness. One night, Ethan brought a flashlight and walked nearly half a mile into the woods. Atlas screamed behind him the entire time, yet the forest revealed nothing. No tracks, no animals, no explanation. The mystery became an obsession. Sadie started keeping notes. She wrote down times, weather conditions, moon phases, anything she thought might matter. The dog always screamed between midnight and 12:12 a.m. Never earlier, never later. Almost to the minute. 2 weeks after moving in, they met their nearest neighbor, a retired logger named Warren Pike. His property sat nearly 2 miles away. Warren was 73, thin as a fence post, his face weathered by decades of mountain winters. When Ethan casually mentioned Atlas's strange behavior, Warren's expression changed, only slightly, but enough to notice. The old man stared toward the valley, then asked a strange question. "Does the dog face north when it happens?" Ethan felt a chill. "Yeah," Warren nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Then he changed the subject. The conversation ended, but Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day he drove into Elk Ridge. The town consisted of little more than a grocery store, gas station, church, and diner. A place where everyone seemed to know everyone. While drinking coffee at the diner, Ethan asked locals about the valley. Most shrugged. A few mentioned old logging roads. One elderly woman said the area had once been home to a small, seasonal camp decades earlier. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained Atlas. Yet when Ethan mentioned Warren Pike's reaction, several people exchanged looks. Nobody elaborated. That silence bothered him more than any answer could have. Back at the cabin, Atlas seemed increasingly agitated. He stopped sleeping through the night. He refused to enter certain parts of the forest. Most strangely, he became fixated on a narrow ridge north of the property. Every walk eventually led there. Every time Atlas reached the base of the ridge, he began whining intensely, then pulling harder, as though trying to drag someone uphill. Ethan finally decided to follow. The climb wasn't easy. Loose rocks, dense undergrowth, fallen trees. Atlas moved with determination. Halfway up, Ethan noticed something unusual. The forest changed. The trees grew older, larger, untouched, unlike the surrounding area which showed signs of historical logging. Near the top, Atlas stopped. He stood motionless, staring toward a cluster of pines, then began digging frantically. Snow and dirt flew behind him. Ethan knelt beside the dog. At first he found nothing. Then his hand struck metal. An old rusted survey marker protruded from the soil, a small metal plate. Weathered almost beyond recognition, the engraving had mostly disappeared. Only a few letters remained visible. C-A-M-P, camp. Nothing else. No explanation. No clue. Still, the discovery lingered in Ethan's mind. That night, Atlas screamed louder than ever. The sound echoed through the valley. Sadie cried herself to sleep. Claire began suggesting they move. For the first time, Ethan considered it, yet curiosity kept pulling him deeper. 3 days later, a snowstorm rolled through the mountains, the kind of storm that erased roads and swallowed landmarks. The family stayed inside. The valley disappeared beneath white curtains of wind. Just before midnight, Atlas became frantic, more frantic than usual. He scratched at the front door, barked, whined, then began screaming. But this time something was different. He wasn't looking through the window. He was staring directly at the door, as though something stood outside. Ethan opened it. Snow blasted into the cabin. The darkness beyond seemed alive with swirling white. Then he saw it, a faint light, far across the valley, moving. At first he thought it was a vehicle, but there were no roads there. The light drifted slowly between trees, then vanished. Ethan told himself it was a trick of the storm, a reflection, a coincidence. Yet Atlas remained fixated on the same spot until sunrise. The following morning, Ethan snowshoed toward where he'd seen the light. The journey took nearly 2 hours. The terrain was rough, steep, isolated. When he reached the area, he found something unexpected. Tracks. Human tracks. Fresh. Single set, leading north. No return prints. Just footprints disappearing deeper into the mountains. Ethan followed them, not far. Maybe half a mile. Then they vanished beneath drifting snow. The mystery deepened. Someone had been out there during the storm. Someone walking through terrain where nobody should have been. That evening, Ethan visited Warren again. This time he pushed harder. The old logger listened silently. Finally, he sighed, then told Ethan a story. 40 years earlier, before the valley became nearly abandoned, a wilderness therapy camp had operated in the mountains. It wasn't famous. It wasn't large. Just a small private program for troubled teenagers. The camp eventually closed. Most people forgot it existed. When Ethan asked why it closed, Warren hesitated, then answered, an accident. A teenager disappeared during a winter survival exercise. Search teams spent weeks looking, hundreds of volunteers, dogs, helicopters. Nothing. The boy vanished without a trace. The camp folded soon afterward. His family never received answers. The story sent chills through Ethan. But it still didn't explain Atlas. One missing teenager 40 years earlier couldn't account for nightly screams. Could it? That night, Ethan searched public records online. The internet connection was weak, slow. But eventually he found archived newspaper articles. The missing boy's name was Noah Bennett, 16 years old. Last seen in January of 1984. Photos showed a smiling teenager wearing a winter jacket. One detail immediately caught Ethan's attention. The search maps. The last known location. It was remarkably close to their valley. Very close. Close enough that the old camp marker Atlas discovered might have belonged to the same property. Ethan showed Claire. She looked unsettled but unconvinced. A decades-old disappearance seemed tragic, yet unrelated. Still, Atlas continued screaming. Every night. Every single night. Days later, another clue emerged. Sadie found it. While exploring the cabin's attic, she discovered a weathered cardboard box tucked beneath insulation. Inside were old documents left behind by previous owners. Most were worthless. Receipts, manuals, maps. Then she found a photograph. The image was faded, damaged, but visible. A group of teenagers standing in snow. Behind them sat a wooden sign, Northridge Wilderness Program. One teenager stood apart from the others. Tall, dark-haired, looking directly into the camera. The back of the photograph carried a handwritten note. January 1984. Noah's final week. The room fell silent. Why would a photograph connected to the missing boy be hidden inside their cabin? Claire felt uneasy. Ethan felt something else, a growing certainty that Atlas wasn't reacting randomly. The next morning, Ethan visited the county records office 2 towns away. The clerk helped him access property histories. Hours passed. Eventually, a connection emerged. Their cabin had once belonged to a counselor employed at Northridge Wilderness Program. The man had lived there during the early 80s, the same period Noah disappeared. After that, the trail went cold. No criminal findings, no charges, no evidence. Just unanswered questions. Questions that had remained buried for decades. Until Atlas arrived. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Just before midnight, Atlas rose, walked to the window, and screamed. Ethan joined him. For the first time, he noticed something. The dog wasn't staring into the forest, generally. He was focused on a specific point, a narrow opening between distant trees. The same direction as the ridge. The same direction as the old camp. The same direction as the footprints. Ethan marked the line on a map, then compared it to historical survey documents. His heart began pounding. The line intersected with a location known as Raven Gulch, a steep ravine hidden beyond the ridge. Difficult to access, rarely visited. The next morning, Ethan packed supplies. Atlas immediately sensed the destination. The dog became excited, determined, as if he knew exactly where they were going. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Hours passed. The mountains grew steeper, wilder. Eventually, they reached Raven Gulch. The ravine plunged hundreds of feet into dense timber. Dangerous terrain. The kind of place search teams could easily miss decades earlier. Atlas moved along the edge, sniffing constantly. Then he stopped. His entire body stiffened. He began whining, not screaming, not barking, whining. A heartbreaking sound. The dog descended a narrow slope. Ethan followed carefully. 30 yards down, Atlas reached a patch of ground beside a massive fallen tree. Then he began digging again, frantically. Snow scattered. Dirt flew. Minutes passed, and Atlas uncovered fabric. Weathered. Rotting. Ethan froze. A sleeve. An old jacket sleeve. Partially buried beneath roots. He immediately contacted authorities. The discovery triggered an official investigation. Forensic teams arrived. Search crews examined the site. The mountains buzzed with activity for the first time in decades. The results shocked everyone. The jacket matched clothing described in Noah Bennett's disappearance records. Additional items were recovered nearby. Personal belongings, fragments of equipment, evidence long hidden beneath layers of earth and vegetation. But the greatest surprise was still coming. Forensic reconstruction revealed something unexpected. No signs of foul play, no evidence of murder, no attack, no criminal conspiracy. Instead, investigators pieced together a heartbreaking sequence of events. During the winter exercise, Noah had apparently become separated from his group. A sudden storm swept through the mountains. Visibility collapsed. Disoriented, he traveled in the wrong direction, eventually reaching Raven Gulch. The terrain trapped him. An accidental fall caused severe injuries. Search teams had come remarkably close, within a few hundred yards, yet dense snow and impossible conditions concealed the location. For 42 years, the mystery remained unsolved. The revelation brought closure to a family that had spent decades wondering. Noah's younger sister, now in her 60s, traveled to Idaho when the news broke. She met Ethan, met Claire, and met Atlas. The woman cried while stroking the Husky's fur. She said her parents died without answers, without knowing what happened to their son, without being able to bring him home. Now finally they knew. The story spread across local news. People called Atlas a miracle dog, a hero, but Ethan wasn't satisfied. One question remained. How? How could a Husky locate evidence connected to a 42-year-old disappearance? The answer emerged from an unexpected source. A canine behavior specialist contacted investigators after reading reports. The expert reviewed everything. Atlas's history, the cabin, the ridge, the camp, the nightly screaming, then offered a theory. Not supernatural, not impossible, just extraordinary. Years before being adopted by the Mercers, Atlas had lived as a rescue dog near a search and rescue training facility in Oregon. Records showed he had repeatedly wandered into scent training exercises. Dogs possess scent capabilities humans can barely comprehend. Certain odors can persist in environments far longer than people realize, particularly in cold mountain regions. Combined with trace environmental factors, old human remains, personal effects, and specific terrain conditions, scent signatures can linger in ways science still studies. Atlas may have encountered faint traces connected to Noah's belongings during walks near the ridge. The odor could have triggered deeply embedded, search-related instincts developed years earlier. The theory explained part of it, but not all. Why the screaming? Why midnight? That answer arrived months later, and it changed everything. While researchers examined old camp records, another detail surfaced. Northridge Wilderness Program maintained strict schedules, including nightly emergency signal drills. Every night at midnight, counselors tested an old mechanical siren located near the ridge. Former campers remembered it vividly. The sound echoed through the valley, a haunting wail, long, drawn out, almost identical to the tone Atlas produced. The siren stopped operating after the camp closed. Yet acoustic studies suggested faint environmental effects still occurred under certain weather conditions. Wind moving through damaged structures and abandoned metal. Components near the ridge occasionally generated frequencies similar to the original signal. Frequencies too subtle for most humans to notice, but not for dogs, especially sensitive dogs. Atlas wasn't responding to nothing. He was hearing something, a sound humans couldn't perceive. A sound linked directly to the camp. Night after night, the frequency drew his attention toward the ridge, toward Raven Gulch, toward Noah. The explanation stunned experts, not because it was impossible, because it was so improbable. A rescue husky with unusual scent experience. A forgotten mountain camp, a decades-old disappearance. An abandoned siren producing nearly imperceptible frequencies. One chain of events connecting them all. The odds seemed impossible, yet there it was. Months later, spring arrived. Snow melted. Wildflowers covered the valley. The mountains softened. Life moved forward. But something remarkable happened. Atlas stopped screaming completely. The behavior vanished overnight. No pacing. No midnight distress. No fixation on the window. Nothing. For the first time since arriving in Idaho, the cabin became quiet, truly quiet. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, not unsettling. Peaceful. As if something unresolved had finally settled. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind distant peaks. Atlas rested beside him. The dog looked older somehow, calmer, content. Ethan thought about his friend who died in the construction accident, about the guilt he'd carried, the questions he could never answer, the things he couldn't change. For more than a year, he had been trapped by uncertainty, trapped by what-ifs, trapped by the belief that every tragedy needed an explanation. Then Atlas had led him into a mystery spanning 4 decades, a mystery that finally gave another family the answers they'd spent a lifetime seeking, and in doing so, something inside Ethan changed. Closure, he realized, wasn't about undoing pain. It was about ending the search, accepting truth, allowing wounds to heal. That summer, Noah Bennett's family held a memorial in Idaho. People from across the region attended. Former campers, search volunteers, retired investigators, residents who remembered the disappearance. Near the end of the ceremony, Noah's sister approached Atlas. She knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered something nobody else could hear. Atlas simply leaned against her, tail wagging gently. No cameras captured the moment. No reporters noticed. Yet Ethan believed it mattered more than every headline, because after 42 years of uncertainty, a family finally had peace. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, a husky had helped them find it. Years later, visitors still asked about the story. They still drove into the valley hoping to see the famous dog. Some expected a legend. Some expected something supernatural. Instead, they found Atlas, usually sleeping on the porch, usually looking bored. Just a dog, at least on the surface. But every now and then, usually around sunset, Ethan would catch Atlas staring toward the distant ridge. Not anxiously, not fearfully, just watching, as if remembering. Then the dog would close his eyes, rest his head on his paws, and return to sleep. The mountain remained unchanged. The forest still whispered in the wind. The valley still disappeared beneath winter snow. Yet one thing was different. The mystery was gone. The unanswered question that had lingered over those mountains for decades had finally been resolved, not by detectives, not by technology, not by chance alone, but by a husky who refused to stay silent, a husky who screamed into the darkness night after night until someone finally listened. And sometimes, when the world feels full of noise, that's the part worth remembering. Not the mystery, not even the discovery, but the simple fact that the truth had been there all along, waiting in the mountains, waiting for someone willing to follow the sound.